The morning breaks quietly over the Pacific, the kind of pale light that turns the ocean silver before it turns blue. The camera glides over the empty stretch of Half Moon Bay. Long shadows, faint gull cries, no human sound except a whisper of waves brushing against the shore. The tide is low, revealing dark streaks of seaweed and shells scattered like forgotten bones. The narrator's voice comes in, calm, detached, poetic, speaking of how the ocean has the power to erase everything. Footprints fade, names dissolve, and even the strongest memories are carried away into the deep, where time is no measure. There's something eternal about coastlines. People come to them to begin, to end, to forget. On this same beach, on a warm July day in 2004, a young woman named Mara Ellison arrived with her notebook, her camera, and a small tin box for collecting shells. She would walk into the afternoon sun and never return. The tone remains tender, not sensational. The ocean isn't presented as a villain, but as a witness, old, watchful, dispassionate. The narrator continues, describing how Disappearance by the sea has a strange poetry to it. Unlike the violence of the city or the precision of crime, the sea leaves no edges. It softens every story until all that remains is speculation. Was she taken by a wave? Did she walk out willingly? Did something, or someone, wait for her in the mist? The image shifts to a rusted bulletin board near the dunes. Faded posters ripple in the wind. Among them, Mara's face, smiling, hopeful, a photograph taken from a friend's birthday. Her name has nearly washed away from the ink, the way all paper does under salt air. The narrator reflects on how the world forgets quickly. Newspapers move on, people marry, rebuild, relocate, but the ocean keeps its secrets. Somewhere beneath that calm surface, 1,000 untold stories sleep. The scene transitions into the sound of the waves, slowing down, growing distant. The tide pulls back, and the narrator lowers their voice as if confiding something deeply personal. We like to believe we can explain disappearance, that we can chart on a map or file it in a report. But some vanishings, the voice says, don't take place in the physical world. They happen in the in-between, where grief meets obsession and silence starts to speak. The words linger over a montage of images, a red scarf tangled in driftwood, an old camera half buried in the sand, an empty beach chair facing the horizon. Everything about the scene feels peaceful, but unsettlingly so, as if peace itself has been earned through loss. The narration takes on a reflective tone, describing how the sea is a paradox. Giver and taker, mirror and grave. Fishermen trust it, scientists study it, lovers meet by it, and yet none of them ever truly understand it. Every tide carries something unseen, the voice continues. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, it gives back what it took, not as it was, but as a story. The camera closes in on the waves, reaching a single shell lying in sand. It rocks gently, almost as if breathing. A whisper, indistinguishable from the surf, fades into the background. A woman's laugh, soft, far away. Then silence. This opening leaves the viewer suspended between beauty and unease, aware that this isn't just a disappearance story. It's an invitation into a memory preserved by the ocean itself, a mystery that feels less like a crime and more like a haunting echo from a place where time stands still. The sun was already high when Mara pulled her car into the small dirt lot by the beach. The kind of July day that feels endless, the air warm but not yet heavy, the ocean light playing tricks with the horizon. Her hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment before she turned off the ignition, as if she were taking the stillness before stepping into something sacred. Inside the car, the faint scent of salt and sunscreen mixed with the paper smell of her notebooks. She checked her camera battery, tucked the pen behind her ear, and smiled at her own reflection in the rearview mirror, the look of someone perfectly at home near water. Outside, the sound of children carried from a distant stretch of sand. Seagulls cried overhead, and the rhythmic pulse of the tide rolled in steady and sure. Mara slung her old canvas bag over her shoulder and walked barefoot down the dune path, her shadow long and sure against the soft sand. She was a familiar figure here. Locals remembered her. The quiet marine biology student who spent hours crouched over titipools, muttering to herself, sketching shells, recording notes about ocean acoustics. They said she had a kind of peaceful energy, the kind that makes people smile without knowing why. It was around noon when she spread out her small towel near the rocks, opened her field journal, and began to write. Her handwriting was neat, looping, scientific, and emotional at once. She recorded water temperature, shell patterns, cloud formations. Yet in between data entries, there were lines that didn't sound like research. Things like, "The wave spoke softly today," and "I think the sea remembers faces." She didn't hide her eccentricities. She treated her research as part observation, part conversation. A local fisherman named Carlos passed by and waved. He'd seen her dozens of times before, always alone, always content. "Working hard again," he called out. She laughed and replied, "Listening harder than I'm working." He would later tell police she seemed happy, like she'd found something she was waiting for. That small detail would echo later, when investigators tried to reconstruct her final moments. By mid-afternoon, the beach filled with people. Kids ran toward the surf. Couples unpacked picnics. Dogs chased driftwood. Mara hardly noticed. Her attention was fixed on the shells she was gathering, not just collecting, but sorting them into a deliberate pattern. She arranged them in spirals, tiny geometric constellations of pink and white, each labeled with notes on texture, sound, and tone. When a light breeze passed through, she leaned closer and listened as if the shells whispered back. To her, the beach was an archive, every shell a fragment of memory stored in calcium. Her camera clicked quietly in the background. Close-ups of shell ridges, long exposures of water moving over rock. One photograph would later be found undeveloped in her camera. The shot of the horizon, slightly tilted, as though taken in a hurry. The light in it was strange, a thick, diffused glow that made the sea look like molten glass. At 3:17 p.m., a family walking north toward the cliffs saw her sitting near the edge of the tide line, sketching. She smiled politely when their young daughter offered her a small conch. "That's a moon shell," Mara said. "If you listen close, you can hear where it's been." The child pressed it to her ear, laughed, and ran back to her parents. It was the last confirmed interaction anyone had with her. Around 4 p.m., the day began to change. The ocean breeze turned cooler, sharper. The tide crept higher. Some beachgoers started packing up, but Mara stayed, now facing west, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her notes from that afternoon, later found damp but legible, end abruptly. The last line reads, "The water sounds different today, as if something beneath it is breathing." Narratively, this moment marks the point before the shift. Everything here glows with the golden calm of a day too beautiful to end. The world is ordinary, yet charged with quiet foreshadowing. The mood isn't ominous. It's serene, almost dreamlike, but with a subtle awareness that something has begun to change in the distance. The camera would linger on her final footprints, leading toward the water, the wind lifting grains of sand into soft spirals. Her bag sits on a blanket, open. Inside, her notebook, a small voice recorder, and the tin box of shells, half full, half waiting. As the waves wash closer, the sound deepens. The horizon swallows the light. The narrator's voice returns, gentle but heavy with implication. There are moments that look ordinary until you realize they were the last time anyone saw her alive. The scene fades not with drama, but with absence, a quiet frame of the beach returning to its rhythm. The ocean, unbothered, continues breathing, as if nothing at all has changed. By the time the afternoon began to tilt toward evening, the warmth that had wrapped the beach in gold started to cool into something else. The light dimmed in small, almost imperceptible ways, the color of the ocean darkening, the wind picking up in scattered, unpredictable bursts. Seagulls that had crowded the shore began to drift inland. It was around 5 p.m. when the first veil of fog rolled in, sliding low across the surface of the sea like smoke curling from a deep wound. The few people still on the beach noticed it. The fog wasn't gradual, not like the soft marine layer they were used to. It came fast, swallowing the horizon in seconds. The cliffs blurred, the lifeguard tower vanished, and even the sound of the waves changed, a muffled pulse, close but indistinct. Somewhere in that shifting gray, Mara Ellison was still collecting shells. One witness, a couple walking their dog. Later said they saw her kneeling near the surf line, her figure almost ghost-like against the thickening mist. They heard her humming softly, something melodic, repetitive, nearly lost beneath the wind. When the fog reached the shore, they turned back toward the parking lot. When they looked again, she was gone. The fog carried a strange quality that day. Locals described it later as too heavy to breathe. The moisture hung in the air like a curtain, dense and cold, cutting visibility down to only a few feet. Phones lost signal. Radios went static. The beach transformed from an open expanse into a closed room made of sound and salt. For some, it felt almost supernatural, as if the sea itself had exhaled, reclaiming what it wanted. At 5:32 p.m., a man named Henry Bloom drove along the coastal road that curved above the bay. Through the fog, he noticed a car parked oddly close to the sand entrance, a faded blue Toyota Corolla with the driver's side window half open. He thought nothing of it until hours later, when he passed by again and saw it still there, empty, untouched, its lights faintly fogged over. When investigators later examined the car, they found Mara's bag in the passenger seat. Her keys were still in the ignition, her wallet on the dashboard, a folded towel on the back seat. The radio was off. Nothing appeared stolen or disturbed. The sand on the floor mat was fresh, as though she returned the car briefly, then changed her mind and walked back toward the sea. The next morning, her friend and mentor, Dr. Alan Kerr, received a voicemail from Mara timestamped 5:47 p.m. The message was just 6 seconds long, a low rush of wind, the distant echo of waves, and her voice saying, almost in a whisper, "It's changing again." When he tried to call back, her phone went straight to voicemail. The fog lingered late into the night. Search teams said it was one of the thickest coastal mists in recent memory. Flashlights were nearly useless. Sound bounced strangely. Voices seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The ocean, which normally hissed and rolled with clear rhythm, seemed to speak in broken pulses, like breathing underwater. By dawn, the beach was empty. Mara's footprints were found leading down the slope toward the tide, then stopping abruptly at the edge of the foam. The sand was smooth beyond that point. No sign of struggle, no return tracks. Only the faint imprint of something circular nearby, a pattern that some described as a spiral, pressed faintly into wet ground, already being erased by the morning tide. The sheriff's first press statement was calm and procedural. At this time, we believe Miss Ellison may have been overtaken by the fog and the incoming tide. Conditions were poor for visibility. There are no indications of foul play. But among locals, the story began to twist almost immediately. Some said the fog that night was unnatural. Some claimed they heard someone calling from the water after midnight. Not a scream, but a calm, rhythmic voice repeating something they couldn't understand. The emotional tone of that night would become the beating heart of the mystery. What began as a day of study and sunlight had transformed into a landscape of disorientation. The beach that felt wide and alive now seemed infinite, as if it could absorb a person whole without ripple or trace. The ocean, silent and gray, was no longer just scenery. It was an active presence, listening. Back at the parking lot, the ranger's log recorded something odd at 6:10 p.m. A note scribbled hastily by an officer named Daniels. Fog too thick to continue patrol. Heard movement near shore. Couldn't locate source. That single line became part of the official record, but no one ever followed it up. Later that week, when the weather cleared, volunteers combed every inch of coastline. They found her sandals halfway down the dune trail, placed side by side. They found her camera near a rock pool, lens fogged, battery dead. The last image on a roll, a half-captured frame of the waterline, showed a shape at the edge of the surf that no one could identify. Some said it looked like her shadow stretching toward the waves. Others said it looked like something standing there, waiting. Emotionally, this section isn't about terror. It's about the eerie stillness that follows it, the quiet dread of something vast and indifferent. The fog becomes symbol of uncertainty, of the way grief clouds perception, of how easily a person can vanish when nature decides not to explain itself. The narration describes it gently, almost reverently. The ocean has no reason to return what it takes. It simply folds the living into its rhythm, and the world above must learn to move without them. The final image of this section shows the fog lifting the next morning, revealing the beach clean and pale, as if nothing had happened at all. A single shell, cracked and water-worn, sits near the water's edge, the only sign that anyone had been there. The tide reaches for it, pulls it under, and the camera lingers until it disappears completely. The investigation began before sunrise the next morning, though by then, the ocean had already wiped the canvas clean. Officers walked the damp sand, their boots sinking with each step, scanning for anything at all, that might explain how a woman could vanish in such a narrow stretch of beach. The first hour brought silence, broken only by the sound of radios crackling against the hum of the waves. The air still smelled of fog, heavy with salt, as if the sea had left a trace of its breath behind. Deputy Sheriff Elaine Porter led the initial team. She had seen drownings before, but something about this one felt off. The car hadn't been vandalized, no signs of struggle, no torn fabric or footprints leading back inland. If she went in, Porter muttered, the ocean took her fast. But there was doubt in her tone, quiet and persistent, the kind that lingers even after logic has done its best. Divers entered the water by mid-morning. The tide was restless, pulling strong, visibility near zero. They searched the coves and trenches, their flashlights sweeping across rock walls slick with seaweed. One diver, later interviewed for a local paper, said it was like swimming through milk. After 4 hours, they surfaced with nothing. No body, no bag, no trace of fabric or blood. Just emptiness. The media arrived before noon, turning the search into spectacle. Cameras pointed toward the shore as volunteers combed the dunes in long, deliberate lines. A reporter from Channel 7 stood near Mara's car, describing her as a promising young scientist with fascination for the ocean that may have led her too close to danger. The tone was rehearsed professional, but shallow. Viewers at home saw another story of another missing woman, a headline to fill an evening segment. What they didn't see was how the people who actually knew her sister, her colleagues, her students, stood silently near the rocks, watching the waves for a sign that would never come. By evening, the official narrative began to form: accidental drowning. The sheriff's department issued a brief statement citing high tide, poor visibility, and the likelihood that Mara had been swept away by a riptide while conducting her shell study. It was logical. It was tidy. It was also deeply unsatisfying. There was no witness to her entering the water, no personal effects recovered from the surf, and her research notebook, one she carried everywhere, was missing. In the days that followed, the search expanded along 20 miles of coastline. Helicopters scanned the cliffs with thermal cameras. Patrol boats dragged sonar lines along the seabed. Dozens of volunteers joined the effort, forming human chains along the shore. Still, nothing surfaced. No body, no drifted belongings, no clothing washed ashore. The ocean had closed its mouth. The emotional weight began to shift. At first, people spoke about Mara in the present tense. She is still out there. She's probably stranded somewhere. But as the days passed, the language softened. She was such a bright person. That slow change in grammar, the living tense turning to past, became the quiet proof that hope was dissolving. Elena Ellison, Mara's sister, arrived from Sacramento on the 4th day. She was 32, composed, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who held herself together even in disaster. She met with detectives, studied the maps, retraced her sister's route. She wouldn't have gone swimming, she said firmly. She's careful. She measures the tides before she even walks near the water. No one contradicted her, but no one could give her an alternative explanation either. Porter noticed how Elena kept glancing toward the sea, as if expecting it to answer. She used to talk about the ocean like it was alive. Elena said once, almost to herself, like it had moods, like it knew things. The officers said nothing. They were used to grief speaking in metaphors. The following week, Dr. Alan Kerr, Mara's research advisor, handed over her university files. Among them were reports from her ongoing project on acoustic anomalies in coastal shelf formations. It sounded obscure, academic, harmless, but one line in her note stood out: Certain shell structures amplify frequencies not present in their surroundings, possibly residual sound captured from the seafloor. Kerr explained that Mara had been fascinated by how shells could hold sound, echoes of their environment, microvibrations, remnants of ancient currents. The investigators nodded politely but moved on. It wasn't relevant to a missing person case. For Elena, though, that detail was everything. She began to read her sister's research obsessively. Late nights in the motel room, she pored over the photocopied pages, searching for meaning in the numbers, sketches, and lines of poetic notation. The seventh one hums. Some shells breathe. The seer remembers. The tone of the investigation changed over time, from urgency to bureaucracy. Reports were filed, then filed away. Evidence logs sat untouched. The sheriff's office moved on to newer cases. Sometimes the ocean gives back, Deputy Porter said in a later interview. Sometimes it doesn't. You learn not to take it personally. Months passed. The posters faded from the bulletin boards. The local papers stopped covering the story. Her name became a cautionary echo among hikers and beachgoers, a reminder to stay on marked paths, to respect the tides. But for Elena, it never ended. Each night she dreamed of water, dark, slow-moving water that seemed to whisper in her sleep. She began hearing her sister's voice faintly when near the shore, like the memory of someone speaking from the other side of a wall. She dismissed it at first, chalking it up to grief. But the dreams kept returning, always beginning with fog, always ending with the sound of something breathing beneath the waves. A year later, the case file was officially closed. The cause of death listed as presumed drowning. There was no funeral, only a quiet gathering at the beach where Elena threw flowers into the surf. The ocean looked calm that day, almost indifferent. The petals floated for a moment before vanishing beneath a soft wave. The emotional resonance of this section is slow and suffocating. The transformation of tragedy into process, of raw pain into paperwork. The narrative tone captures how investigations don't always solve mysteries. They simply record their boundaries. It's the moment where the story shifts from public search to private obsession, from law to grief. Before leaving Half Moon Bay, Elena returned to her sister's apartment, expecting to find only silence. But when she opened the door, the smell of sea salt lingered faintly in the air, even after a year. Dust covered everything except for one box on the table. On its lid, in her sister's handwriting, were the words, "Shells do not open until ready." The camera lingers there, as if the entire story had been waiting for that box to be found. The investigation had ended, but the real search, something far deeper and more personal, was only about to begin. The apartment had been sealed since the investigation closed, a quiet capsule of a life suspended in mid-motion. When Elena turned the key, the lock gave way with a dry click, and the door opened to the smell of time, stale air, faint salt, and something sweet like decayed flowers. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through dusty curtains. The place was small but orderly, frozen exactly as her sister had left it. The coffee mug still sat beside the window. A notebook lay open on the kitchen table, a pen resting diagonally across a half-finished sentence. A sweater hung neatly over the back of a chair, one sleeve slipping toward the floor like an arm reaching out. For a long time, Elena didn't move. She had spent months imagining this moment, walking into her sister's space, expecting it to feel haunted, expecting maybe a sign or an answer. Instead, it felt ordinary. That was somehow worse. The refrigerator hummed softly. The clock on the wall had stopped at 5:46. Dust had gathered on the bookshelf in thin gray coats. Everything here was static, perfectly preserved, and yet beneath the stillness, there was the quiet vibration of something unresolved. She moved through the rooms carefully, her fingers brushing over objects as if they might dissolve with too much pressure. A sketch pinned to the wall showing the tide line drawn like a heartbeat, a collection of sea glass in a jar labeled Voices, a Polaroid of the beach taken days before Mara disappeared. Every item seemed deliberate, curated, almost ritualistic. Mara hadn't just lived here. She'd been documenting her relationship with the ocean, like a lover chronicling the moods of someone unknowable. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, though the indentation of her last sleep still lingered faintly on the pillow. A single shell rested on the nightstand, white, spiral, unremarkable, except for the faint pencil inscription on its edge. North wind hums. Elena picked it up, held it to her ear instinctively, and listened. Only silence. But the silence felt heavy, like it was waiting to say something. When she finally reached the small workspace at the end of the hallway, she found what she hadn't realized she was looking for. On the desk sat a box about the size of a loaf of bread, covered in thin layers of dust. It was taped shut, and on the lid, in Mara's familiar looping handwriting, were the words, "Shells, do not open until ready." The words hit her like a pulse. She traced them with her fingertips, the ink slightly smudged, the message both intimate and cryptic. What did it mean to be ready? Ready for grief? Ready for truth? Ready for something worse? She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat in Mara's chair and let her eyes wander across the desk. There were pages of notes scattered beneath old receipts and postcards, fragments of thought written in bursts. Shells store sound. Each one is a vessel. Not memory. Echo. It was part science, part poetry, part madness. Elena remembered how her sister used to talk about her research as though it were alive, as though the ocean wasn't just a subject, but a collaborator. As evening fell, she made tea using the same kettle that still sat by the stove. The water hissed, the air filled with a faint metallic scent, and for a moment, she felt as if she were borrowing Mara's life, standing in the same rhythm, repeating her gestures. She sat by the window where her sister must have sat countless times, looking out toward the distant shimmer of the sea. The coastline wasn't visible from the apartment, but Elena swore she could still feel it, a presence just beyond sight, pulling at her the way tides pull at the moon. Hours passed. The apartment grew darker. The hum of traffic below faded. Only the sound of her breathing filled the space. Finally, as if guided by something both logical and deeply emotional, she returned to the box. She peeled the tape slowly, each rip echoing louder than it should have in the small room. Inside, she found 12 shells, each carefully wrapped in thin pieces of linen. Each had a handwritten tag tied with delicate string. Notes like, "Listen here, at dusk, she answers, 7 hum." The handwriting was unmistakably Mara's, neat, precise, but trembling slightly, as if she'd written them in haste or under some emotional weight. Elena unwrapped the first shell, a pale orange scallop with faint ridges that shimmered under the lamplight. The tag read, "For beginning." She held it in her palm. It was smooth, warm from her touch. She lifted it to her ear, half smiling at her own foolishness, expecting nothing but the familiar hollow rush of the ocean. But what she heard was different. Softer, higher, like a whisper buried in static. She froze, listening harder. There was a rhythm in it, not quite words, not quite sound, but human somehow, as if someone were breathing faintly inside. She set it down, heart racing. Logic rushed in to fill the space that fear had just carved out. It must have been the apartment's pipes, or the hum of the refrigerator, or simply her imagination. But still, she found herself unwrapping the next one, then the next. Each shell carried a small phrase, each one strange in the last. Listen backwards. 7th hum. Before the fog. She arranged them carefully on the table, realizing as she did that they formed a spiral, not random, but deliberate, almost identical to the spiral pattern she'd seen in her sister's field sketches. As she traced the curve with her finger, something stirred in her memory, a story Mara used to tell when they were kids, about how the sea kept secrets in spirals, how every shell was a door that opened inward instead of outward. Back then, it was only a bedtime tale. Now it felt like a message. Emotionally, the scene swells with both grief and curiosity. Elena is no longer mourning. She's being drawn. The apartment, once a space of loss, now feels alive, filled with invisible motion. The objects hum with memory, as if Mara has left not just artifacts, but instructions. By midnight, the apartment is silent again. The shells sit in a neat spiral on the desk, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Elena leans back in her chair, exhausted, unable to decide whether she feels closer to her sister or farther from her than ever. The fog has returned outside, pressing softly against the window, blurring the city lights into diffused halos. Somewhere below, the faint echo of a ship's horn drifts through the night. Elena whispers to the empty room, "What will you try to tell me, Mara?" The only response is a steady, hollow hum from the shells, faint, rhythmic, and alive. This section closes with the emotional pivot that defines the rest of the story. The transition from ordinary grief to something deeper, more consuming. The mystery no longer belongs to the police. It belongs to her now, to a sister who has just crossed the quiet threshold between remembrance and obsession. Elena couldn't sleep that night. The box sat open on the table like an unblinking eye, its contents shimmering faintly in the dim yellow light. The shells, now unwrapped and arranged in a spiral, seemed to change subtly with each glance. Colors deepening, surfaces glistening like wet glass though the room was dry. The apartment had taken on a strange stillness, one that hummed beneath the silence. It wasn't fear she felt exactly. It was presence. She spent hours staring at them, tracing the pattern over and over again. It wasn't random. It couldn't be. Each shell was tagged, each label deliberate, each phrase part of something larger. Listen here. At dusk, the seventh hum. She wrote the phrases down in her notebook, searching for patterns, like trying to decode a language half remembered from a dream. Her logical mind, the one that believed in science, in measurable truths, insisted this was nothing more than grief manifesting through superstition. Yet another part of her, quieter but older, whispered that her sister had left her a map. As dawn began to touch the horizon, Elena noticed something she hadn't before. The shells, when arranged in their spiral, mirrored the geography of Half Moon Bay. The ridges matched the coastline. The central point of the spiral aligned almost perfectly with the glass coves, the restricted tidal area Mara had written about in her research notes. That was where her sister had last taken samples. That was where she'd vanished. Elena felt her pulse quicken. The rational explanation, that this was coincidence, slipped further from reach. She remembered one of Mara's old conversations about acoustic resonance, how certain shells could capture and replay sound waves like miniature recorders. Mara had once joked, if you listen close enough, the ocean might answer back. At the time, Elena laughed, but now, alone in the dim apartment, she began to wonder if Mara hadn't been joking at all. She moved closer to the spiral, kneeling down until her face hovered just inches from the shells. "What were you trying to show me?" she whispered. The sound of her own voice seemed to ripple across them, as if the shells absorbed her words. When she leaned in, the faint hum returned, a low, delicate vibration, like wind trapped in a hollow place. One by one, she pressed the shells to her ear. The first few carried only faint static in the usual oceanic rush, but the fifth was different. Beneath the noise, she heard what sounded like a human voice. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech, muffled, distant, like something recorded underwater. She froze, listening harder, her hand trembling. The voice faded, replaced by a low, resonant tone that seemed to throb in sync with her heartbeat. She dropped the shell onto the table, breath shallow. For several seconds, she couldn't move. Logic screamed inside her head, searching for an explanation. Perhaps the shape of the shell was amplifying environmental noise. Perhaps the city's vibration, traffic, plumbing, wind had aligned with its natural frequency. Yet no part of her truly believed that. This wasn't random sound. It felt deliberate, intentional. She turned on her sister's old tape recorder, the same one found in her field kit, and placed it beside the shells. She hit record, then leaned close again. The hum was still there, but faint now, pulsing like a hidden heartbeat. She began whispering softly, testing the sound. "Mara, if this is something you left, if you can hear me," her voice caught. The moment felt absurd, and yet the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, faintly, from somewhere within the spiral, she heard a sound. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks, like someone tapping gently from inside the sea. Elena stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The recorder whirred softly. Her pulse pounded in her ears. When she finally replayed the tape, there was those same knocks, clear and real, not static, not distortion. 3 perfect, deliberate beats. She replayed it again and again until the sun rose and the apartment filled with pale light. By morning, she was trembling, caught between awe and terror. Every rational part of her training told her this was grief, exhaustion, the mind's way of creating order out of chaos. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her sister was somehow alive in these patterns, alive not in flesh, but in frequency. Over the next few days, Elena became consumed by the shells. She recorded their sounds at different times of day. She mapped their arrangement on graph paper, studying the intervals and distances like musical notes. She began to notice that their hums changed with temperature, humidity, even her proximity. The seventh shell, labeled "She Answers," would begin vibrating slightly whenever she approached it after dark. When she whispered Mara's name, the vibration would intensify. The spiral pattern grew beyond the table. She added other shells found in her sister's apartment, ones from old jars and drawers. She followed the pattern until it reached across the floor, curling toward the window like a living thing. Sometimes at night, she'd wake to find the shells faintly rattling, shifting against one another with the rhythm of distant waves. The deeper she went, the more the boundaries between science and the supernatural blurred. She read Mara's thesis drafts until her eyes burned, finding strange marginal notes that seemed more like confessions and data they remembered differently at dusk. Each pattern repeats when I'm alone. Sound is a form of memory. Elena began to see her sister not as a victim, but as an explorer who'd wandered too far into something vast, something not meant to be understood. And now, that same current was pulling her in. Emotionally, the tone of the story shifts here from quiet grief to active descent. What had started as mourning has transformed into obsession, into the slow unraveling of reason. The shells are no longer mere artifacts. They're instruments of communication, a bridge between the living and the lost. Elena becomes both scientist and believer, crossing the threshold her sister once crossed. On the fifth night, unable to resist, she turned off all the lights, sat in the center of the spiral, and waited. The room was utterly dark except for the faint luminescence from the shell's wet sheen. The air felt charged, almost electric. The hum began faintly, rising in waves, surrounding her like breath. For the first time, she didn't listen with fear. She listened with recognition. And in that moment, barely audible beneath the oceanic murmur, she heard her sister's voice. A whisper, broken but unmistakable. Not gone. Listening. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She reached toward the sound, but the hum cut off suddenly, plunging the room into silence so deep it ached. She sat there for a long time, motionless, realizing she had just crossed a line between searching and summoning. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt through the half-open window. Somewhere far below, the tide crashed against the rocks, perfectly timed with the rhythm of her own breath. The shells gleamed faintly in the dark, as though they had just exhaled. By the following afternoon, the world outside Elena's apartment had shrunk to a dull blur of noise and motion she no longer registered. Her phone buzzed with unanswered messages from work, from friends, even from her mother, but she barely noticed. Every waking thought had begun to orbit that spiral of shells and the faint, impossible whisper she had heard. It wasn't madness, she told herself. It couldn't be. She had proof, the recording. The tape recorder sat beside her, its buttons worn smooth, its display faintly flickering like a heartbeat. She rewound the tape over and over, playing the same 6 seconds again and again. The sound was faint but distinct. 3 slow knocks, then a breath. Once, during playback, she thought she could hear her name layer beneath the static. But the mind has its own cruel tricks. It gives shape to noise when it craves meaning. Still, she couldn't let go. When she examined the recorder more closely, she noticed a second cassette tucked beneath the battery compartment. It was labeled in her sister's handwriting, smudged and half-faded. Specimen number 42. The number meant something. She remembered seeing it scribbled in Mara's notebook in reference to an audio sample recorded near the anomaly at Glass Coves. Elena's hands trembled as she loaded the tape. She hit play. At first, there was only static, that familiar hiss of analog emptiness. Then, slowly beneath it, the faint sound of waves. A woman's voice emerged, distant, fractured, as though speaking from underwater. The frequency holds longer here, repeating itself as if the sea's remembering. It was Mara. Her tone was calm, deliberate, almost reverent, like a scientist talking to herself during an experiment. Elena turned up the volume, straining to catch every syllable. Sound doesn't disappear. It settles. The shells, they're not echoes, they're containers. Memory in mineral form. Then a pause. The tape crackled. A faint wind-like tone rose beneath her sister's voice, low, resonant, rhythmic. It wasn't mechanical. It was organic, like the deep exhale of something vast and alive. Coordinates logged, returning tomorrow at dusk. The sea remembers me. The last words came out in a whisper, so soft it blended with the static. Then the tape went silent. Elena sat frozen, her pulse thudding in her ears. Her first instinct was denial. It had to be old data, just field notes distorted by the tape's age. But the phrasing, the tone, her sister hadn't been documenting. She'd been confessing. The sea remembers me. That wasn't science. That was surrender. She replayed again and again and again until she began to hear small details she'd missed before. Faint clicks, distant knocks, the echo of waves crashing in strange syncopation. It felt less like sound and more like language. The longer she listened, the more the air in the apartment seemed to respond. The shells on the table began to vibrate faintly. Some rolled a few inches, aligning themselves into a tighter spiral. The sound from the tape, those deep pulsing tones, seemed to resonate with the shells, as though they were absorbing it, feeding on it. Elena's rational mind fractured further. Every instinct told her to stop, to turn off the recorder, to leave the apartment and breathe. But another voice, quiet, seductive, familiar, told her that she was closer to the truth than anyone had ever been. If her sister had left this recording intentionally, it was because she wanted her to find it. She found Mara's field journal, flipped through the pages until she reached a section marked with a folded corner. Scrawled across the top, acoustic memory field test, specimen number 42. Below were coordinates, wave diagrams, and a single line written in darker ink. She only answers when the tide breathes in. That night, Elena played the tape one last time. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the shells, the recorder placed in the center of the spiral. The sound filled the room, soft and hollow, a heartbeat made of water. Somewhere within the hum, she could swear she heard her sister's voice again, this time clearer, closer. Come back to where it began. Her eyes burned with tears. Mara, she whispered, what did you do? There was a pause, a strange mechanical flutter in the tape, as if the recording were trying to respond. Then, through a burst of static, came a whisper so faint she almost doubted it was real. I didn't go missing. I crossed over. The tape cut off. Elena sat completely still. Her throat tightened. The apartment seemed to pulse faintly, as though the walls were breathing with her. Every shadow felt alive. Her reflection in the window looked slightly delayed, out of sync. She turned off her recorder, but the faint hum didn't stop. It continued from somewhere deeper, within the shells themselves. The line between hallucination and communication thinned to nothing. She spent hours replaying the tape, writing down timestamps, comparing sound waves on her laptop. The patterns were too symmetrical, too intentional. They formed spirals when visualized, perfect Fibonacci sequences, like the natural geometry of shells. By midnight, exhaustion set in. Her mind felt stretched thin, vibrating with the same tension as the objects around her. She knew what she had to do. She needed to follow the coordinates her sister had left behind. But before she could close her notebook, a new sound emerged from the recorder. It wasn't playing, it was recording. The red light blinked. No one had pressed it. From the speaker came faint background noise, the hum of the apartment, the distant city traffic, and then, buried beneath it, a single voice, Elena's own. It was her, recorded hours earlier, whispering to the shells. Mara, if this is something you left, if you can hear me. But the reply was new. A different voice, Mara's, gentle and distorted. I hear you. Elena's breath hitched. Her hand trembled as she turned off the machine. But even in silence, The echo of that phrase seemed to linger in the air. Emotionally, this section becomes a mirror. Elena stepping into the same pattern that consumed her sister. The discovery of the tape isn't just evidence, it's invitation. Her grief has mutated into obsession, her curiosity into communion. The shells and the recordings are now one system, the physical and the spiritual converging through sound. Before sleeping, she places the tape recorder back into the box with the shells. The red light blinks once more, then fades. She lies awake, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the tide outside her window. The sound feels closer than it should, as if the ocean has crept up the street, whispering just below her floorboards. When she finally drifts into sleep, she dreams of standing at the shore again. The fog returns, thick and alive, and somewhere within it, a figure waits, pale, still, and familiar. Mara. She's holding a shell to her ear, eyes closed, listening to something only the sea can say. Elena wakes with a start before dawn, her pillow damp with tears. The shells hum softly in the corner, and the recorder clicks by itself, as if rewinding. The next morning, the city felt distant, irrelevant. Elena packed quickly, her camera, a notebook, and the small tin box containing the 12 shells. The decision to go to the glass coves didn't feel like a choice. It was something already written, something her sister had begun, and she was now obligated to finish. As she drove along Highway 1, fog drifted low over the ocean, that same endless gray veil that swallowed Mara 2 years before. Every few miles, the sea appeared and disappeared beside her like a slow, living shadow. When she reached the cliffs overlooking the restricted Titapool zone, the wind cut sharp and clean, smelling of kelp and iron. The clothes, the public signs were faded, half buried in sand. Elena climbed over the warning rope, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a quiet, reverent resolve. The path wound down the cliffside, slick with sea mist. She could hear the crash of waves long before she saw them. The glass coves lived up to their name. At low tide, the pools glistened like mirrors, smooth, crystalline water caught between black volcanic rock. Tiny ripples shimmered under the pale light, creating distorted reflections of the sky. The world above looked fractured, as if viewed through layers of memory. Elena knelt at the edge of the largest pool, her reflection bending and reforming with each ripple. For a moment, she saw not herself but her sister's face, a brief flicker that vanished when she blinked. She unpacked the shells one by one, laying them on the stone in the same spiral pattern she had arranged in the apartment. The sound of the sea seemed to shift as she did, deepening, slowing, as if responding to movement. When she placed the final shell, the one labeled seventh hum, the wind died completely. Everything stilled. Even the gulls went silent. Elena set her recorder beside the spiral, pressed a button, and waited. The only sound was a faint hiss of static blending with the pulse of distant surf. She leaned close, her breath shallow. Then came the first sound, a low harmonic vibration rising from the shells, almost imperceptible at first. The tones wove together like the start of a symphony, echoing against the rock walls in a perfect, unnatural rhythm. The water in the pools began to tremble, forming concentric ripples that moved inward, not outward. The ocean was pulling toward the center. She spoke into the recorder. Her voice steady though her hands shook. "This is Elena Ellison. Field Test 1. Acoustic anomaly responding to." Before she could finish, a sudden burst of sound filled the air, a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. It was identical to the tone she had heard on Mara's tape. The ground felt alive beneath her palms. She checked the recorder's display and froze. The waveform forming on its small screen wasn't random noise. It was a pattern, the same spiral geometry that matched the shells. Elena's breath caught. "You were right," she whispered. "They're not echoes. They're maps." She dipped the recorder into the pool's edge, the microphone just above the surface. The sound changed instantly. What had been abstract became articulate, almost vocal. It was a voice, faint but distinct, rising and falling with the rhythm of the tide. Elna, her name, drawn out through water and wind, stretched in by distance. It was impossible, yet it was her sister's voice, layered within the sound of the sea. The moment cracked something inside her. She dropped the recorder, clutching the rock for balance. Her reflection shimmered beneath the surface, and again it wasn't her face staring back. It was Mara's. Her expression calm, almost smiling, eyes open and unafraid. "You're here," Elena whispered. The reflection nodded, or maybe it was just the movement of the water. The hum deepened, and beneath it, she heard another sound. Faint whispers overlapping, thousands of them, like an underwater chorus speaking in languages older than memory. For the first time, Elena felt not fear, but awe. She realized the truth her sister had hinted at. The ocean wasn't merely water. It was an archive, a living consciousness that stored everything it touched. Sound, memory, emotion, loss. Every tide was a page being written and erased, again and again. The shells were its memory stones, shaped by centuries of whispers compressed into form. She placed her hand into the water. It was cold, but not lifeless. The vibration ran through her fingers like electricity. For a second, she felt warmth, then images, flashes of Mara walking along the beach, her notebook open, her laughter mingling with the wind, then flashes of others, faces she didn't know, moments long buried. The ocean was showing her as memories, not as visions, but as feelings. Emotionally, the experience was overwhelming. Elena wasn't merely watching her sister's world. She was stepping inside it. The boundaries between them dissolved. The living and the lost, the listener and the echo. The water began to rise, climbing over her wrists, then her forearms. She didn't move. She let it surround her. The recorder sputtered, emitting soft bursts of static. Through the distortion, Mara's voice surfaced once more, clearer now. "Don't be afraid. It's only sound." The words repeated until they blended with the crashing waves. Elena felt herself crying without realizing it, her tears indistinguishable from the salt spray on her skin. When she finally stood, the wind returned suddenly, violent and cold, scattering the shells across the rocks. The spiral broke apart. The hum ceased. She gathered what she could, stuffing the wet shells into her bag. The recorder continued to hum faintly even after she switched it off, as if it had absorbed the ocean's pulse. As she climbed back up the path, the world above felt alien. The sky was gray but brighter now, and the air buzzed with static energy. She glanced back once at the glass coves. The tide was already rising, swallowing the pools whole. It was as if nothing had ever been there. Back in her car, she played the tape. The recording was chaotic. Bursts of noise, overlapping frequencies, and then, faintly, Mara's voice again. "Everything the sea takes, it keeps in sound. Don't let them erase me." Elena leaned her head against the steering wheel. Her hands were trembling, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She understood now. The ocean didn't destroy, it preserved. Every voice lost to it still spoke, just in a different frequency. The emotional weight of this moment is both revelation and surrender. The mystery ceases to be about death or disappearance. It becomes a story of translation, how memory persists when the body does not. The sea has become the ultimate witness, a keeper of all that has been lost. As she drove away, the horizon shimmered faintly in her rear-view mirror. For a second, she thought she saw movement in the surf, a silhouette standing knee-deep in water, unmoving, watching her go. It might have been her imagination, or it might have been her sister, waiting for her next return. The recorder, lying on the passenger seat, continued to hum softly, in perfect rhythm with the waves she was leaving behind. The sky was already bruising into night when Elena returned home. The ocean's voice seemed to follow her, not in sound, but in rhythm. Every heartbeat matched the slow pull of the tide. She left the recorder on the passenger seat, still faintly vibrating from whatever energy it had absorbed at the glass coves. As she parked near her building, she noticed how the fog had come early, rolling through the streets in soft, low waves, thick enough to blur the streetlights into trembling orbs of gold. She climbed the stairs slowly, the box of shells clutched to her chest. Inside the apartment, everything felt heavier, denser, as though the air itself carried water. The shells were damp, glistening faintly though she hadn't touched the sea for hours. She spread them again across the table, but this time she didn't arrange them in a spiral. She left them where they fell. The pattern formed itself anyway. Perfect symmetry, as if guided by something unseen. She set the recorder beside them, pressing play. The tape hissed softly. Beneath it, the ocean's hum. Then the faint echo of Mara's voice. Everything the sea takes, it keeps in sound. Don't let them erase me. Elena whispered into the silence. I won't. She hadn't realized how much she missed the sound of another human voice until she heard her sisters again, even if it was broken by static. It wasn't comfort exactly, it was connection. Proof that she wasn't speaking into nothing. That night, she slept on the couch beside the shells, her hand resting near the recorder like someone sleeping next to a heartbeat. Sometime around 3 a.m., the hum returned. It started soft, then deepened into something layered, harmonic, like 2 or 3 frequencies overlapping. Her eyes snapped open. The shells were moving, not rolling randomly, shifting in sequence. Their ridges caught the moonlight from the window, flashing like signals. She sat up, watching, frozen between fear and wonder. And then she heard it. Footsteps outside her door. Slow, deliberate, each one wet, as if coming from the sea. She stood without thinking. The air smelled of salt and cold wind. When she reached the window, the fog outside was alive, swirling, pulsing, parting just enough to reveal the faint outline of the beach far below. She shouldn't have been able to see that far from here. The moonlight glowed against the tide, and there, standing knee-deep in the surf, was a figure. The shape was unmistakable. Slender, hair long and dark, body swaying slightly as if moved by the current. It was too far to see the face, but every instinct in her screamed the same truth. Mara. The world narrowed to that one point. She left the apartment barefoot, clutching the untagged shell she had found earlier, the one with no inscription, the one that hummed faintly even when silent. She ran down the hill, through the sleeping streets, the fog growing thicker until the world became nothing but gray and salt. The closer she came to the ocean, the more the hum intensified. By the time she reached the sand, the sound was everywhere. In her bones, her teeth, her blood. The tide glowed faintly with phosphorescence, each wave rimmed in blue fire. And there, just beyond the first break, stood the figure. "Mara!" she called, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. She stepped forward, the cold water shocking against her ankles. The fog coiled tighter, swallowing everything but the sea and the silhouette ahead. "Mara, please." The figure turned its head, just slightly, enough for Elena to see that it had her sister's face. Pale, luminous, both alive and not. The eyes were open but unreadable, reflecting light that didn't exist. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the two sisters stared at each other across the threshold between worlds. Then the wave surged higher. The figure lifted its hand, not to beckon, but to offer something. When the water rolled back, a shell floated toward the shore, spinning slowly until it landed by Elena's feet. A single, new shell, smooth, perfect, and unmarked. She bent down and picked it up. It was warm. When she held it to her ear, the voice that spoke was not her sister's. It was her own. "Go back." The sea exploded in light. The figure dissolved into mist, scattering into the phosphorescent tide until there was nothing left but the hum. Elena stumbled backward, half running through the fog, clutching the shell to her chest. By the time she reached the dune, the ocean had gone completely still, the glow fading as though it had never been there. Back in her apartment, she sat shaking, drenched in salt water, heart hammering. She placed the shell on the table beside the others. For a moment, she thought she saw her sister's reflection in the darkened window, not looking at her, but past her, as if listening to something deeper. The room felt wrong now, bent somehow, as if the boundary between worlds had been pulled too thin. When she picked up the recorder again, it was already on. The tape inside wasn't hers. It was new, labeled only with a date, tonight. She pressed play. Her voice came through the static, calm, measured, whispering something she didn't remember saying. "The sea remembers everything. Now it remembers me too." The shell on the table pulsed once, a faint glow beneath its surface, as if something inside it was still alive. Emotionally, the moment lands like quiet revelation, not terror, but the haunting recognition that connection has its cost. Elena hasn't found her sister. She's joined her in a way that blurs what living means. The sea has answered her call, but only by mirroring it back. The echo is perfect and perfectly tragic. As the section closes, Elena lies awake beside the shells. The fog presses against the windows like breath. In the faint glow of dawn, she watches the shells rearrange themselves once more into that familiar spiral. But this time, at its center, lies a new one, the untagged shell that now carries her own voice. The ocean has taken another story, and as always, it leaves behind only a whisper. The morning after the encounter, Elena sat motionless at the kitchen table, staring at the shell that had come from the sea. Sunlight seeped through the fog window in a pale, uneven glow, glancing off the smooth surface of the object that now dominated her world. The apartment was heavy with still air, saturated with a faint, metallic scent of salt. The clock on the wall ticked softly but without meaning. She had lost her sense of hours, of days, of sequence. The only rhythm that still made sense was the pulse of the tide. She reached for the shell. It was warm again, faintly humming, though she hadn't touched it all night. The other shells were silent now, as if deferring to this one. The 13th, the unmarked, the final. When she lifted it to her ear, she didn't hear the familiar oceanic rush. She heard a breath, then her sister's voice, whispering faintly between syllables of static. "You came back. I knew you would." Elena's throat tightened. "Where are you?" she whispered. "Not gone," the voice replied, just translated. Then silence. She lowered the shell, staring at it as though it might explain itself. She wanted to cry, to scream, to laugh, but emotion seemed useless now, a human habit she had outgrown. What was there left to feel when the line between the living and the dead had become a conversation? Over the following days, she began to document everything. Every hum, every tone, every change in temperature around the shells. Her notes filled entire pages, but reading them back felt like deciphering a foreign language. The more she wrote, the less human her words became. Sentences fractured into fragments of sound notation. Equations, fragments of longing disguised as research. She realized she wasn't writing about her sister anymore. She was writing with her. At night, she recorded new tapes, placing the shells near the microphone and whispering questions into static. Sometimes she received answers, faint, delayed echoes of her own voice, altered in pitch and tone. Other times, there was only silence, the kind that carried meaning. One evening, exhausted from the endless hum, she walked down to the beach again. The fog was thinner this time, the air still. The ocean shimmered softly beneath the dying light. She carried the 13th shell in her hand, pressing it to her palm like a heartbeat. She stood where the tide met the sand and spoke aloud, her voice trembling. "If you're there, if you can hear me, tell me what you want me to do." The waves responded in a rhythm she recognized. 3 slow pulses, a pause, then one long sigh. It was the same pattern she'd heard on Mara's recording from Glass Coves. She realized then that her sister hadn't been trying to prove something. She had been trying to communicate. The ocean wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a message, a vessel, and Mara had found a way to enter it. Elena knelt and dug a shallow hole in the wet sand. One by one, she placed the shells inside, the 12 from the apartment, and finally the 13th. As they touched the ground, each gave a faint vibration, a harmonic resonance that traveled to her fingertips. The air shifted around her, soundless yet alive. She whispered, "You're home now." But even as she said it, she hesitated. Was she burying them or planting them? She stayed there for hours, watching the tide creep closer, letting the cold water wrap around her legs. She imagined the ocean as a great archive, recording everything it touched, not in ink or memory, but in vibration. Every life, every loss, every cry swallowed by the waves lived somewhere down there, layered like sediment. Mara was not lost. She had been absorbed. When the water finally reached the shells, the sound began again, that low hum, rising in volume until it filled the entire shore. The vibration carried to the sand, up her arms, into her chest. It wasn't frightening. It was intimate, like being embraced by something infinite. She could have left then. She could have walked away, pretended this was closure. But she didn't move. She knew she was standing in the same place her sister had once stood, facing the same horizon, listening to the same voice. The ocean was whispering her name now. The pull wasn't physical. It was emotional, magnetic, ancient. In her final voice recording, later recovered from the apartment, she speaks softly, almost serenely. There's a point when listening becomes joining, when the echo stops being memory and becomes presence. I think she found that point. I think I'm close. The next morning, beachgoers found her car parked at the same overlook where Mara's had been left 2 years earlier. Inside were her notebooks, her recordings, and a sealed letter addressed to the university. The handwriting was steady, precise. The note inside read, "The sea doesn't take, it preserves. It's not a grave, it's an archive. Everything we love is somewhere in its sound." Elena Ellison was never seen again. A week later, the tide washed ashore a cluster of shells arranged in a perfect spiral, exactly like the one from her apartment. They were bleached white by the salt, edges smooth by motion. At the center sat a single shell, unmarked, still faintly warm to the touch. When marine biologists examined the pattern, they noted something extraordinary. The shells, when placed near one another, emitted a faint frequency, 18 hertz, the same infrasonic range associated with distant storms and with human emotion. The discovery was filed away, catalogued, forgotten, but the shell at the center was never claimed. Emotionally, this section is a slow fade, the quiet descent from obsession into transcendence. It's not tragedy in the conventional sense. It's transformation. Elena has crossed the same invisible threshold her sister did, surrendering not to death, but to the vast continuity of sound and memory that lives within the sea. The narrator returns softly, the voice calm and reverent. Some people search for answers in words. Others find them in silence. But some, the rare few, hear meaning in the spaces between. The Ellison sisters learned the truth that frightened everyone else. The ocean never forgets. It only waits. As the waves roll against the shore, the camera pans across the sand where the spiral once lay. The tide has erased it again, leaving only the sound of water folding against itself. Endless, gentle, eternal. The ocean was calm the morning they found the new spiral. The tide had receded unusually far, revealing a wide, flat expanse of sand glistening under the soft light of dawn. A group of early tourists were first to notice it. An intricate pattern formed from hundreds of shells arranged in perfect geometry, spiraling outward like a galaxy etched into the earth. At first, they thought it was an art installation, some coastal tribute to the Ellison sisters' story that had become local folklore. But when the pattern was measured, it matched the one from the 2004 case exactly, line for line, curve for curve, even the number of shells. At its center lay one shell unlike the rest, pale blue, translucent, and smooth as glass. Written delicately along its rim, in handwriting faint but unmistakable, were 2 words. For Elena. The police arrived shortly after, cordoning off the area. Photos were taken, statements recorded, theories spun like driftwood in the tide. Some said it was the work of pranksters. Others believed it was part of a memorial someone had made in secret. But there was no trace of footprints around the formation, no sign that anyone had approached it by land. The pattern had simply appeared overnight, as if the tide itself had built it. Dr. Alan Kerr, Mara's former professor, came out of retirement to examine the shells. When he touched the one in the center, he swore he felt a faint vibration, like a pulse, low and constant, as if the shell were breathing. He later wrote in his notes, "The resonance matches recordings from 2004 and 2006. The frequency is identical. It's as though the ocean replayed itself." By evening, the tide began to rise again. The waves rolled slowly across the beach, erasing the spiral bit by bit. The tourists watched in silence as the sea reclaimed what it had offered. Within an hour, there was no trace of the pattern at all. Only the faint hum of the wind remained, and even that sounded like the ocean whispering something too soft for human ears to catch. The story spread quickly. News stations replayed old footage of Mara's disappearance, layering it with new images of the shell spiral. Words like miracle and curse circulated online, while others dismissed it as coincidence. But for those who had followed the case, something deeper resonated, a feeling that the story had come full circle. The sisters, two women separated by mystery and time, had somehow found each other again, not in body but in frequency. In the weeks that followed, beachgoers reported strange phenomena along that stretch of coast. Radios picked up faint murmurs when tuned near certain stations. Dogs refused to approach the water. And some nights, when the tide was particularly low, people claimed to hear laughter carried faintly across the waves. The laughter of two women, familiar and haunting, woven into the rhythm of the surf. The narrator returns here, calm, introspective, their voice carrying the slow gravity of the sea. Perhaps the ocean is not a place at all, but a memory, a vast, breathing archive that keeps what we lose until the world forgets why it mattered. The Ellison sisters believed the sea could speak, and maybe it can, not in words, but in patterns and the repetition of waves, in the echo of sound that never truly fades. The imagery deepens, the water shimmering like liquid glass, the shells glowing faintly beneath the surface, the hum reverberating as if the ocean itself has learned how to dream. Dr. Kerr's report concludes with a single line that feels more like confession than data. If sound can remember, then maybe silence is what it forgets. Emotionally, the story settles into stillness, not peace exactly, but a kind of transcendence. The mystery is no longer about loss or proof. It's about continuity. The sisters' voices emerge with a natural order, their story dissolved into rhythm and tide. The horror of their disappearance transforms into something sacred, something eternal. The final sequence unfolds with cinematic quiet. The camera moves underwater, where light filters through in soft shafts. The viewer sees a shelf of ancient shells, thousands of them, stacked and glittering beneath the waves, an underwater library of sound. Faint voices rise and fall within the current, as if the ocean itself is humming to keep them alive. Then, from the darkness, a faint shape emerges. Two figures, distant but distinct, walking side by side along the ocean floor. They don't look lost. They don't look afraid. Their movements are slow and graceful, bodies haloed in faint blue light. As they pass, the shells around them tremble gently, releasing tiny bursts of sound, the remnants of every word ever spoken above the sea. The narrator closes softly. In the end, no one truly disappears. The ocean keeps what we cannot hold. Every sound, every breath, every goodbye. It all drifts somewhere below, waiting for the right tide to bring it back. The screen fades to black. The hum fades into the sound of slow, steady wave. And just before silence claims a frame, the faint echo of a whisper, two voices overlapping, timeless. Listen. Then nothing, only the sea. The tide rises slowly, folding over the sand like breath. The ocean is calm again. No storm, no wind, only the quiet rhythm of something infinite returning to itself. The light is soft, the horizon colorless, dissolving into gray. The narrator's voice returns, low and steady. Some say the sea takes. Others say it remembers. But maybe it does both. Maybe every disappearance is just a translation into another language, the language of water. The frame drifts over the beach, smooth and untouched. For a moment, faint patterns shimmer beneath the surface, the ghost of a spiral, erased and reborn with each wave. The hum begins softly in the background, woven into the sound of the tide. It isn't frightening anymore. It's tender, like a lullaby for what was lost. Fragments of Mara's field notes fade onto screen, one after another. Sound doesn't die. The ocean is an archive. Everything returns. They dissolve into the water, as if being reabsorbed by the sea that inspired them. The music rises. Slow cello, faint wind, the pulse of distant surf. The camera sinks below the surface one last time, revealing the vast stillness beneath. Two shells rest side by side on the ocean floor, faintly glowing. Their light flickers in rhythm. Two heartbeats, perfectly in sync. The narrator whispers, "What we lose becomes part of the sound the world makes when it dreams." The glow fades. The water darkens. The sound of the tide takes over, endless, patient, eternal. And then, just before silence, listen,